it was kind of in terms of thinking about inequity. That was the frame that the federal government was using. Now the federal government is using its funds in a very different way, right? It's all about rewarding competition, right? That's a very different way of thinking about how I'm going to use my money. Make up for the gaps in terms of how we're meeting the needs of underserved students versus reward those who are competing the most successfully, right? It's a very different frame, but that's just one of the indications of how neoliberal ideology has kind of shaped and come to shape federal government funding priorities.
Yeah.
But it's not just the federal government, right? It's also about one of the major structural changes that we think are going to improve schools is putting schools in competition with things like charter schools and choice programs, right? So what's one of the things that you have to do if you're going to get raised to the top funds? You have to show how you're going to move more and more towards charter schooling, right? There are some super charter schools out there, right? So I don't want to blanketly dismiss charter schools, but charter schools and choice programs were originally developed by people who were saying, how can we most privatize public education? How can we most disinvest and make it into a private economy? And it was through choice and charter school programs, right? That's what we see with Renaissance 2010, right? Renaissance 2010 here in Chicago, Arne Duncan's kind of signature program. Who came up with the blueprint for that? Well, a year before Arne Duncan released his blueprint for Renaissance 2010, the Commercial Club of Chicago put out their report called Left Behind. Left Behind lays the blueprint for what we now know as Renaissance 2010. So it was a business group that was basically saying, let's improve public education in Chicago by creating a whole bunch of for-profit run charter schools. That was their plan, right? When Duncan took it over, he kind of took out the for-profit part, but as an explicit goal, but it has hugely still informed how we've revamped the Chicago public schools, right? We're very much moving towards privatization, and that's what we see happening at the national level as well. So in many ways, neoliberalism has come to define, and while, I guess my overall argument is, while it has its roots in the emergence of conservatism in the United States, it has become incredibly commonsensical, so that it's not just the conservatives who are pushing for privatization and for competition, right? The other major common sense thing that I think we see even with Obama and Duncan is this notion that it's all about the teacher, right?
I've seen that, yes.
Right? Obama said, I had these great quotes from Obama and Duncan that's all about saying, you know, what's the most important thing we need to do for schools? We need to get great teachers into schools, and no more excuses for the bad ones, right? So we can see a film like Waiting for Superman that even Oprah will champion, right? Because we have these strong leaders like Michelle Rhee who's saying there's a whole bunch of lazy and incompetent teachers, and so what's the solution? I'm going to fire a whole bunch of them, right? So what's the problem with this? Well, remember I was saying that Frameworks Institute had done this study about what does the everyday American think about education reform.
Yes.
Well, one of the things that the everyday American thinks is that education means the K-12 classroom, right? When we talk about education, what's the image that comes into my mind? What a teacher is doing in the classroom, right? So we don't think about funding. That's not what people think about. People don't think about segregation. People don't think about school district, leadership. We don't think about governance. We think about, right? Exactly. So, not surprisingly then, when we see news stories about the great things happening in schools, it's about what's happening in a school or a classroom, right? It's not about structural stuff. When we talk about all that's bad about schools, it's all falls on the shoulders of teachers, right? And this gets reinforced with the whole language around testing, right? If improvements in education mean we're going to see increases in test scores, right? That's how everyone talks about improvements in education, right? We're going to see increases in test scores. Well, then that means learning is all about what you can demonstrate on a test, and teaching is all about raising those scores. So again, it goes back to, well, so what's the major problem with education? We have teachers who can't raise those scores, right? So we need to get rid of the ones who can't do that, and we need to bring in ones who can. This is another very commonsensical way of thinking about teaching. So I can stand up here and talk as much as I want about the problems with inequity in funding, right? That's going to go over most people's heads, because most people are like, all right, there are schools that are struggling, but in even struggling schools, aren't there great teachers who can raise test scores? And isn't that what we need to be focusing on? Like, it's a very commonsensical way of thinking about things. It's a very compelling way, right? And so, again, it goes back to, until we can get people to see the bigger picture, the common sense is what's going to mask all of these other arguments. And in fact, there's one other thing that I found very compelling in that study by Frameworks, and it is this notion that we all use this language of crisis, right? It really began in like the early 1980s with the Reagan administration when it released this report, A Nation at Risk. It's what some scholars call the manufactured crisis, right? It's the sense that, oh, look at all these bad things are happening, we need to jump in, we need to fix the problem. And of course, we define the problem very narrowly, so then the solutions are also very narrow. But the point is, we're all stuck in this language of crisis. I use this language too. All the time I'm talking about, we have to, this is a horrible time for teachers. Okay, so we all use this language of crisis, right? And it's true, it's a horrible time for teachers. But what the study showed is that when we use language of crisis, people feel overwhelmed. What? There's problems with segregation and funding and governance and high-stakes testing and how do we even begin to address what you're saying is the bigger picture, all this structural stuff? What's the one thing I do have control over? The classroom that my child attends. So the language of crisis makes us a little bit more conservative, right? It makes us want to focus on the much more local and narrow. And so again, it raises the question, all right, so we need to be very smart about how we try to talk about the problems in education, right? We can't talk about it in a way that leaves people feeling disempowered, right? So yeah, lots of challenges with the framing, right?
It is.